then turned to look back at his friend, and Gabriel was gone. This is the craziest UFO phenomena true story, and it came from my dad. In the 1960s in Ethiopia, my dad was just a child, 9 years old at the time, playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turned his back for a second, then turned to look back at his friend, and Gabriel was gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was the Minister of Interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard from which Gabriel disappeared had 10-foot bricked walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple of hours passed, and his parents, my dad's parents, and the guards were searching, but no sign of Gabriel. 48 hours passed, and now there was a nationwide search for this important general's kid. It was on the news, and police were searching door to door, describing him and what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing his private school uniform, a white shirt and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him, but still there was nothing. A month passed, then 2, then 4, and people started losing hope that he would ever be found, and began to think the worst. Exactly 6 months to the day he disappeared, Gabriel appeared back in my dad's backyard. He was wearing the same white shirt private school uniform, and it was still clean. He looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they confirmed that he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple of nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men, who looked like white guys, could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying, even though they were not Ethiopian. The white glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then all of a sudden in a city that was glowing, clean, and cars were flying around him. There were people there, but they looked strange, like us, but different. One nice man was still with him and took him to a tall building, where he said he had to stay for a while, but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said he could push a button, and the room itself goes places. An open field, the beach, the room itself even flies. He said after a couple of hours, he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was only gone a couple of hours in total. No one believed him. And Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he got possessed by the devil. Gabriel was even forced to see a priest to get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics, and I believe he works in Holland still.
I was scared and wanted to run, but couldn't. Okay, this one is very unique. And I know it's not like any alien encounters I have ever heard anyone else ever talk about. This happened in a very crowded environment over 20 years ago. 2 girls started talking to my friend and me. They weren't really attractive, but they were very nice, and we sat and talked to them for a while. The girl I was talking to looked like she was from India. Her eyes were really wide open, and you could see the entire iris of her eyes. Anyway, she started talking about some weird stuff. She mentioned that our government was going to start tracking us and that one day people wouldn't use cash anymore, which, at the time, sounded pretty far out there. This was pre-internet. Then she went on to say some really far-out stuff, like how she was actually over 80 years old, though she was likely only about 20 or so. It was entertaining, and at one point she even said, "Don't think I'm just some crazy person," which I kind of laughed about. But what happened next is something that is still hard for me to imagine actually happened. She put her hands near my eyes and looked me in the eye. I looked back, and it was like I started falling into her head. That's the best way I can explain it. Then there was a really powerful buzz, and she telepathically showed me she was an alien. I was absolutely terrified at that point. She then pulled her hands away and said, "Now you know." I was scared and wanted to run, but couldn't. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't speak. It was almost as if someone shut me off, and I could only sit there and look around. I saw people walking by, and I wanted to yell for help, but I couldn't. Meanwhile, my friend was just standing there talking to the other girl. After maybe 10 minutes or so, my friend said, "I'm cold, let's go to the car to get my jacket." I still couldn't talk and just looked at the Indian girl alien. He said it again, "Let's go get my jacket." The Indian girl said, "I guess you better go." I was finally able to stand up, but I still couldn't talk. We walked for about 5 minutes, and it was like the spell was broken and I was myself again. I tried to blurt out everything at once, saying, "That girl was an alien and she buzzed my brain." As I said that, the sheer horror of how crazy that sounded hit me. My friend laughed and I laughed, kind of pretending I was just joking. I knew from that day forward nobody would ever believe my story, not even the most die-hard alien enthusiasts. I felt somehow connected to her for another day or so, as if she somehow knew what I was doing in my daily life. I would like to tell myself that it never really happened, that maybe I had some kind of once-in-a-lifetime psychotic break from reality or something that just makes sense. But the fact that she said, "Now you know," out loud right after the telepathic link makes it pretty hard to dismiss as something that was just in my mind. Now this is where things go really weird and crazy. Around 1981, I was a kid in rural Montgomery County, Indiana. It was a perfectly clear day, and I was playing in the front lawn of my neighbor's house with my brother, Pat. My dad was an Indiana State Trooper at the time, and I think that's relevant because we had spent plenty of time around helicopters by that stage in our lives. I knew that these things could hover in place, made a lot of noise and wind, and I knew what they should look like. My brother and I both looked up, over the left side of the roof of my neighbor's house, and we saw 2 silver saucers. They were slowly rotating. We were perhaps 300 feet away. That's like, what, 100 meters to you non-Americans? One was slightly higher than the other, maybe overlapping just a tad. We watched them for a few minutes, just sitting there. This was a perfectly clear, sunny day. After some time, they both accelerated to a ridiculous speed toward the east. We ran inside and told my parents. Now this is where things go really weird and crazy. I've told this UFO story many times, but there's another part of it. I prefer to think this was a dream, because while I can no longer deny the existence of UFOs, this is a bit more sketchy. I was around 3 or 4, which is where most people stop listening, but my memories from that time in my life are extremely vivid. Much of it feels like it happened a week ago. I went to bed one night, my security blanket at my side. Much like my iPhone these days, I wouldn't be caught anywhere without that darn blankie. It's a tad white trashy, but it had a cigarette burn on the edge of it, which for some reason I liked. I had a dream that night that was pretty vivid. I was in a large, dark room. I don't recall being able to see the ceiling. I was walking along a walkway that had a railing, and along the sides and all over this room were holes in the floor. I recall convincing myself that things must live down in there, although I never saw anything. In front of me and to the right was a bright area with beings of some sort who were interested in me. I have absolutely no recollection of what they looked like. While walking toward that light, I dropped my blankie down one of those holes on the left-hand side. Yeah, as you guessed, that bit is going to be key later on. I recall feeling humiliated as these things examined me. Yep, even the usual things that we heard about during so-called abductions, which I don't entirely want to spell out. I don't remember it being a very good time. I woke up the next morning and my blanket was gone. I don't care who you are. You aren't going to forget that at any stage in your life. We looked everywhere for it. I never had a history of sleepwalking, and our home was kind of small. Maybe around 1,500 square feet or so. I remember my parents looking everywhere for that blanket. It was just gone. It was a yellow blanket, and of course I needed a replacement. The replacement was blue, and my mom had to replace her signature cigarette burn. I'm a very skeptical person, and I really prefer to think of this as a dream. But the physical loss of that blanket, and the actual UFO sighting my brother and I experienced around that time, I don't recall if it was before or after, make things really hard to not tie together. It's the weirdest thing that ever happened to me, and I'm all right with you not believing any of it. I've toyed with the idea of hypnosis, and may do that if I'm convinced it isn't rubbish.
I immediately asked them who that man was, and they looked at each other and said, "What man?" When I was around 7 years old, I was primarily raised by my grandparents, who lived in a rural county in East Texas. I'll never forget one day when we had a most unusual man come by the house one afternoon unexpectedly. I remember there being a knock at the door as I was playing in the living room at the time. I called up to announce to my grandparents that someone was at the door. My grandmother took a quick peek out the front window before answering the door, and I glimpsed a very dark-colored or black sedan, unsure of the type, parked outside. Thinking back, I find it odd that I couldn't recall hearing it pull up, as I had been playing near that window for some time. My grandmother answered the door, and to the best of my recollection, the man revealed himself to be some sort of door-to-door salesman. My grandmother invited him in and called for my grandfather. I had never in my life seen a man so pale. He was dressed in essentially all black or very dark blue suit, with a matching hat and initially large sunglasses, which made me wonder if he wasn't blind. They reminded me of that type. He also had one of the saddest excuses for a toupee I've yet to bear witness to. I was totally transfixed on the man and couldn't get over the stark contrast of his pale skin to his seemingly drawn-on pinkish lips. My fixation became apparent, and my grandmother shooed me into a back room to leave the men to talk, so to speak, uninterrupted. Throughout the visit, I kept trying to sneak peeks at the man and commented to my grandmother whether or not she thought he was sick, as he was so pale and thin. Eventually, I suppose he finished his pitch and made his way quite slowly to an exit. I recall as he was leaving, he seemingly passed his hands in front of both of my grandparents' faces and said something to both of them. All I could make out was the word forget, and soon he was on his way. My grandparents seemed to be momentarily in a dull fog after closing the door and quietly pulling off. I never saw him drive off. I immediately asked them who that man was, and they looked at each other and said, "What man?" Now, as you can understand, all three of us were quite baffled. They had no recollection of a visitor, and I had no rational explanation as to how in the hell they couldn't remember that strange-looking salesman. I went on for weeks asking them who the man was and trying to jog their memory. As always, they said there was no one. They even went as far as to say I was mixing up another business acquaintance of my grandfather who had dropped by one day. But I assured them there was no way I could confuse the two, as the man in question was paler than Gollum in the LOTR trilogy, and their friend was nothing of the sort. I had almost forgotten about the incident entirely until watching a show on Sci-Fi related to a MIB theme, and it came back to me. As recently as a year ago, I tried to bring it up again when I was home visiting, and my grandfather didn't remember a thing, while my grandmother again didn't recall the strange man, but vividly remembers me asking for weeks on end about a strange man neither of them ever remembered setting foot in the house.
And its sheer size, around 80 to 100 feet tall, left me speechless. This event occurred in 2011, and it has haunted me every day since. As someone who works in networking, I often finish work late, around 2 a.m., and then stay up for a few hours before going to bed. On this particular evening, it was pouring rain during my drive home. However, by chance the clouds broke when I got home, and I stepped outside for a quick smoke while chatting with one of my buddies about work. The low-lying clouds were reflecting the orange streetlights of Allen, creating an artificial glow. There was a strong breeze, but the rain had stopped. Facing west, I glanced to my right and was astounded to see a massive black cube moving from the north. Traveling south at a speed of about 60 to 80 miles per hour, it moved with one of its corners forward, and its sheer size, around 80 to 100 feet tall, left me speechless. The cube appeared to have a rough stone surface and had a border on one side with a circular symbol inside, resembling a drawn circular maze. The cube disturbed the air behind it, creating a spinning vaporous trail that eventually disappeared. Strangely, there was no sound whatsoever. I immediately told my buddy what I had seen, and since he lived a few miles south, I stumbled over my words while asking him to check if he could see it too. He went out to the middle of his street and looked in the direction I described. But after about 5 minutes, the rain started again, and he stood out in the rain for another 15 minutes without spotting anything. We joked about him being a good friend for trying. Regardless of what others may say or think, I am convinced that I saw what I saw that night. I have faced ridicule and laughter, but I know the truth of what happened. In fact, it is almost a relief to know that such unexplained phenomena exist. As a longtime lurker, I finally had to share this experience, and have been continuously searching for similar encounters with Black Cube UFO every single day. I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm eager to witness it again. I apologize for the somewhat rough drawing I provided, but it depicts the black cube passing directly in front of me, looking as if it was carved from a single stone, with the border and circular pattern visible. Remarkably, the craft had no visible lights, contrary to what I had anticipated. But despite that, I am grateful for the opportunity to have witnessed such a mesmerizing event.
Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the stories, please like and subscribe for more. If you made it this far, type UFOs or aliens in the comments, so I know you're a true fan. Your support means a lot, and we'll be back soon with more.